You can never be too bullish on Bitcoin. But yeah, I've seen some critiques saying too, like, well, Bitcoin might go to a million, but then the money's worthless. I don't think that's the case either, because what we've seen in recent years is you could shut off the entire world economy and it doesn't change anything. You'd think that that would have some massive, massive implications, but everything just kept on humming. And yeah, we have inflation, but it more or less kept going. So I think even with the 1M BTC, uh, we're still going to have that same purchasing power for a while because it takes time for the world to adjust to that shock to the system. The sad fact is the world just does not adjust really well to shocks. And the case in point was the COVID quote unquote pandemic, right? Yeah, like we shut everything down and that was really stupid, but it took years for that to play out. Like even the inflation was not instant. I think Bitcoin will have that same effect. Like Bitcoin will reprice very rapidly because it is traded and moved across markets and borders 24/7. Everything else is not. And also this is why Bitcoin is the truest measurement of value you can get because it doesn't stop for anything, right? If you buy a house, you get repriced once a year when you get your property assessment, right? Things on grocery stores, they need to check their suppliers and see if the price went up, and then they'll get around to it weeks later to update the labels. But the funny thing is, I see some stores now having electronic signs so they can update faster. But it takes a long time for these shocks to the system to permeate. So I think you'll still have $1 million of Bitcoin, $1 million per Bitcoin, and cars will largely cost the same for a few years. And then the shock will hit, and then you'll start to see that change reverberate through that system.
It's also interesting to think, and people perhaps have forgotten that this was the most historically rapid tightening of fiat monetary policy in history, basically. I mean, you can look at the money supply, and it actually went down a little bit. They sucked some of the money back out of the system. And now, if you zoom out, it didn't go down very much.
Yeah.
But it did go down. Like, we have tightened. The printers are idling right now. Meanwhile, as you mentioned earlier, the interest expense on at least the US federal debt is at $1 trillion. The only graph that looks like the interest expense in the debt is maybe the Bitcoin hash rate, which also has a similarly, beautifully parabolic arc to it, signifying something very different and much more hopeful. But people, when you have the chairman of the Federal Reserve who controls the dollar, which is the world's reserve currency, saying things like we are on an unsustainable path, and we know that the only answer for them to deal with this debt is to inflate that debt away. They have to make the debt worth less and then worthless. They're not going to pay it off. That's just not going to happen. So we are going to use our printers. We're going to fire them back up at levels probably never before seen. And if that's happening with the world's reserve currency, it's happening at a much larger, I shudder to think what the Turkish lira is going to do when the US starts easing and printing again. Like, it's not going to look good. The US is still the prettiest horse at the glue factory, but they're still at the fiat glue factory. So, yeah.
Well, it doesn't really matter because the world is more than just the US, right?
Amen.
Other countries will start printing too. Like China, it looks like they're about to start printing, and they also have their ETFs going through in Hong Kong, right? So I think everyone has to print because everything is failing, and the only way out is to print. And that printed money has to go somewhere. So it's this hastening that transition to the Bitcoin standard. That money will go into Bitcoin from the smart people. The dumb people will hang on to the fiat until the very end. But it is this transition period that we're seeing, and it's going to happen very quickly.